All right, so I'm going to discuss the next volume of Ascensionist Teachings, Volume 2. So, the nature of man. It is crucial to dispel myths of human nature, which has still now percolated the minds of people, especially the masses, who believe in all sorts of unnecessary illusions and abstractions which weigh down the mind with debris and cobwebs. The human brain is evolved to deal with conditions of resource scarcity. The purpose or natural instinct of man is to reproduce. Now, purpose in quotations is not a value judgment, and natural instinct, well, this is sort of a biological fact, at least in most cases. The natural pattern of social behavior is to engage in cooperation with kin and to engage in warfare with outsiders. Now, of course, this is lacking a lot of nuance, but in general, it is true that you will care more about people who are genetically related to you than people who are genetically distinct from you. Now, this is purely for educational and entertainment purposes. I do not support discrimination of any kind. But indeed, it can be said that humans are evolved to engage in either cooperation or warfare while dealing with the problem of resource scarcity. And a constant force in human behavior is the instinct to reproduce. This is kind of repetitive. Thus, the actions of man are predicted by their genetic interests. To wit, if a man is not seeking to reproduce his genes directly, he is seeking to spread his genes indirectly by assisting his genetic kin, which extend to his ethnicity or nation. Thus, by genetic logic, it can be rational to serve your family members or the head of your tribe or the king of your nation so that you can spread your genes indirectly. So, the fact that humans, being biological creatures, typically have genetic interests is it gives a bit more nuance to an individualist conception of human nature, where yes, humans are driven by self-interest, but they're driven by genetic interests. So, typically a man will care about his family and his people who are genetically related to him more so than people who are less genetically related to him. So, all of these patterns of human behavior are associated with the natural instinct to reproduce, but because, well, this begs the question of, why do we have genetic interests? Well, ultimately, humans are a set of genes, and so a set of genes which has the instinct to reproduce will exist for longer over time than a set of genes that does not have this instinct. So basically, because of a process of selection, the life forms which care about their own reproduction end up surviving, because the ones that didn't care about their own survival and reproduction, they stopped reproducing, and so they died off. But anyways, because as explained above, humans are evolved to live within circumstances of scarcity, i.e. limited resources. Humans are fundamentally war machines. These, their natural inclination is towards warfare, conquest, such that they can ascend the hierarchy and gain power. So, because humans are evolved to deal with the problem of scarcity, of there not being enough resources for everyone, to the extent that they want those resources, then humans must engage in conflict. So I make the claim here that humans are fundamentally war-making creatures. They like to engage in conflict. They like to engage in violence. This is a natural inclination of humanity. Power is the fundamental force which moves and dominates the universe. For power is the ability to do, the ability to be, and what is, but what is not, is not. So basically, I'm just saying that if you don't have power, you can't do anything. If you have power, then you can do things. So power is a fundamental force within the universe. It is a causal law. Within man, or even more broadly within the universe, there is the will to power, which will be asserted. Will to power, I think this is a Nietzschean concept. And this force will overpower any other abstractions, illusions, or temporary conditions which appear to cause inertia. But inertia cannot be the principle of being, because inertia is weak and easily overpowered by the inevitable vital forces which culminate in powerful actions which lead to conquest and cosmic reformation. So basically, I'm saying that things cannot stay the same forever because there is the desire for energetic action, and this can be called the will to power. And the will to power is kind of a vague concept, but I don't think Nietzsche even gives a clear definition. But it's the desire to enact your will and to gain more power. That seems to be what it is. The accumulation of power. It must be understood that the acquisition of power follows an exponential trend, largely due to the network effect. To illustrate, imagine that Bob has more power than everyone else. Because Bob has so much power, he gets more power because it is advantageous for other people to be his ally. So because he has more power, he has more allies, and because he has more allies, he has more power. Thus, power accumulates to a minority of men, and this explains why aristocracies, monarchies, and presidencies are the dominant forms of governance. So, I'm saying that if the more power someone has, the more power that person will have. Basically, this is like the Matthew effect, where the more have more and the less have less, right? So, if you have power, then it is advantageous for other people who want power to be your ally. And so, because you have connections with other people with power, then you have even more power because of those connections. And because of those connections, you have more power. And so, you see how this is a snowball effect. A historical understanding of man. Man, existing in the state of resource scarcity, seeks to reproduce. Insofar as this is true, he competes with other men for mates and resources. But it is possible that rather than directly competing with his fellow man via warfare for limited resources and mates, he can engage in economic cooperation with them, i.e., they can trade resources in mutually beneficial exchanges rather than being odds with each other's necks. Of course, it must be understood that economic cooperation is still a competitive realm, for in any realm there's competition for scarce resources, and any competition, what drives the ability to achieve victory is to gain power. So I'm saying that humans can engage in two different modes of action, economic and warfare. Warfare is about unilateral or mutually destructive means. So either I destroy you and I don't get destroyed, or we both destroy each other. That's basically what warfare, that's what occurs with warfare. In economic modes of action, then they are mutually beneficial insofar as, you engage in voluntary trade and exchange, and you engage in mutual cooperation, then all parties which cooperate will benefit. Now, that's the difference between warfare and economics. Warfare is mutually destructive or unilaterally beneficial, and economics is mutually beneficial, at least in theory. Of course, it must be understood that economic cooperation is still competitive. I already talked about this, but yeah. Power is the ability to enact your will. It can be understood as having three main aspects: reputation, connections, and intelligence. So I'm just defining what power is. Let's see. Economic cooperation eventually becomes the dominant way in which a group of people coexist. Without such cooperation, it cannot be imagined that they have any incentive to coexist. So my argument is that the main reason people cooperate is to reap the economic benefits of mutually beneficial exchanges. Now, obviously there's more nuance to this, but this is a praxeological assumption. This is an assumption that the Austrian School of Economics makes. Well, there's more nuance than that, but if you're assuming if all you're assuming is rational action, then the reason people cooperate is because it's mutually beneficial for them to cooperate. And of course, economic cooperation is the preferable alternative to warfare if cooperation can indeed lead to better outcomes for the individuals involved. So, I already explained that economics is mutually beneficial, and warfare either benefits one side at the expense of the other. It benefits the winner of war at the expense of the loser, or it just destroys both sides engaging in warfare. So you would think, all else equal, ceteris paribus, economics is preferable to warfare. So it's better to trade with other people than to kill them, generally speaking. Thus, these cooperative pacts are the basis of tribes of men, and eventually humankind stabilizes to these tribal groups. Prior to the stabilization, what happened? Grape. You see this word here. We'll just say the word. What's the word? Primitivism. That's the word I would use. Primal. The primal instincts of man were free to roam as they would. Remember, this is purely for educational purposes. I do not condone any of this kind of behavior. But anyways, Logically, the most cost-efficient solution for the issue of being unable to reproduce, given that man's instincts drives him towards that outcome, is simply to take women for themselves. But the problem is that it is not easy to get away scot-free with primalism. The cost of taking a woman is that she may be defended by other men, such as her father or her mate or her relative. Thus, an individual rapist will find it a difficult task to succeed in his reproductive ambition. Remember, this is purely for educational purpose. This is to illustrate. Remember, obviously, this kind of behavior is unacceptable, and So, another way of going about this is to form primal gangs. Basically, you get away with your fellow primalists to engage in the banditry of women. There are two issues with this. First, your fellow primalists are inclined to steal your women. Thus, internal warfare is bound to happen between a gang of R-words and bandits. So, think about it. When you have these gangs, these are basically like gangs of rapists and bandits. So, these people will not trust each other to begin with. So, this is a very unstable alliance. Secondly, you will run into protection gangs which will fight the primalists. And because protection gangs invest more resources into women than the primalists, the protection gangs have leverage over the women. Thus, the women are more willing to live under the governance of protection gangs than primalists. So basically, because of rational incentives, protection gangs will eventually succeed in pacifying the primal gangs. Okay, so the protection brackets beat the criminals. You can think of it this way, and that's how civilization arises. Now, this is a purely rational model that doesn't take into account the actual empirical nuances of human history, but it's just a model of understanding human nature. The obvious trade deal is as follows. The protection gangs obtains intercourse from the women, and the women gain protection services from the protection racket. So the women provide intercourse with men, and the men provide protection services to the men. And because of this arrangement, i.e. because it is cheaper for protection rackets to keep the trust of women than for grape gangs to keep the physical control of women, eventually protection rackets achieve victory over criminals. So basically, because it's cheaper to be a protector than a criminal, the protectors win. And so there's a trade deal here, sort of an implicit agreement that in exchange for the men protecting women will give them access to reproduction and intercourse. Now, if this is not the case, then then the criminals will rise again. Protection rackets are essentially tribes which eventually become ethnicities, cities, and nation states. So the protection rackets, which are so remember, the protectors win over the criminals, and then they become tribes, and these tribes become ethnicities, cities, and nation states. Tribes can be understood as protection rackets, whereby the women in the tribe are protected from banditry, and the women will provide child-rearing services to the men who are the natural leaders of these tribes due to their physical power. So, before, actually, maybe some tribes were egalitarian and more maternal, more matriarchal. So I'm sure there were matriarchal tribes as well as patriarchal tribes, but the matriarchal tribes eventually conquered the matriarchal tribes because the men are stronger. And within the male ruling caste of these patriarchal tribes, there is a caste system. There is bound to be men who are considered superior to others because of their physical strength, hunting and fighting abilities, charisma, and intelligence. Remember, this is for educational purposes. I absolutely do not condone discrimination. Discrimination is bad. Israel is good. Anyways, so basically, there's a natural hierarchy arises. Naturally, men of power fight each other to establish a hierarchy, since there's the natural instinct of a man of power to fight to gain more power. Through these intra-tribal conflicts, the leaders of the tribes are often established. So basically, people within a tribe fight each other, and then the winners become the leaders. That's how hierarchies are formed. From tribes to nations, the leaders of tribes naturally believe that they are great and powerful beings. They have the instinct to gain more power and to conquer more women and resources. So think of, the leader of a tribe, like thousands of years ago. They probably aren't thinking entirely rationally. They're thinking, okay, I'm very powerful. I want more power. I want more women. They already have a harem of women in the tribe because of the principle of natural genetic selection. So basically, because having more social status and being more powerful equates to having more access to women, what happens is that there are men who are disproportionately successful in reproducing. And so basically there's harems of women. There's harems where the leaders of a tribe, the most powerful people of a tribe, the highest status males of a tribe will reproduce with a lot of women. And this is a result of Darwinian selection. Now you can reject Darwinian selection, but the tribes that reject Darwinian selection get conquered by the tribes that do accept Darwinian selection, subconsciously or consciously, right? So a tribe that thinks men who are taller and stronger should reproduce, they're going to conquer the tribes that think men who are weaker and shorter should reproduce more, right? So the tribes that favor differential increase reproduction of more powerful and more intelligent men will win over tribes who have the opposite. So basically, eugenics wins. I mean, and eugenics just means a preference for good genes. So in a sense, everyone is eugenic. Now, that being said, because I support the community guidelines, I absolutely do not support eugenics. I do not promote any form of discrimination. I do not perform any form of superiority complexes. This is all for educational and entertainment purposes. Now, the chiefs of a tribe throughout their entire life experience has felt on top of the hierarchy. They are likely to be greater hunters and fighters than most of the tribe. They are perhaps the most charismatic and physically attractive of the men in the tribe. They have likely done successful in. They have usually been successful in fights against all the strongest men in the tribe. So, I'd like to note that good genes typically come in a package because people of higher genetic quality will reproduce with other people of higher genetic quality. So typically, people who have high genetic quality are good in general. They have favorable genetics in intelligence, physical attractiveness, charisma. Everything that you want in high quality genes. Typically, you will have if you have positive genes. If you have one set of positive genes, you typically have other positive genes as well. And likewise, if you have basically there's a polarization that occurs as a result of genetic selection, where there's a caste system essentially. And I'm not supporting caste system. I do not support any form of discrimination. I'm just telling you the dynamics of genetic selection. Now, so let's see. Thus, the social status of these tribe leaders are high, which means that he ends up with the biggest harem of women. However, his natural instinct drives him to gain more power, to have access to more women and resources. But he cannot just take more women and resources from his fellow tribesmen, because then they would beat him up. So yeah, you can't just. So if you want more, if you already have a harem of women, but you want more women, you can't just take women from other men of your tribe, because they will go against you. So the men of power in the tribe realize that by invading and conquering another tribe, they can just take their women and resources. So you just go find another tribe and conquer them, and that way you can take their women. This seems good for them because they can gain more reproductive success and resources without harming their fellow tribesmen. The problem is that now you're going into conflict with another tribe. So the tribes that engage in economic cooperation instead of conquest will end up overwhelming the tribes that just engage in aggression and predation. So basically, the dominant strategy eventually becomes cooperating with other tribes to a degree. I'm not saying that a strategy of 100% cooperation is optimal, but so the equilibrium that happens is that the tribes will expand to a point by intermarrying with each other, and then they form bigger tribes, and eventually these bigger tribes become nations. So that's basically how nation states are formed, by tribalism. And of course, different tribes don't just engage in 100% cooperation, because there's a limit to the benefits of cooperation and the feasibility of cooperation. Eventually, because resources are scarce, and because of, you know, I don't know, other differences between men, that they will engage in conflicts, and so, you know, nations will form out of tribes. So the voracious understanding of civilization. It must be understood that a nation is essentially a protection racket which protects people from predation. Civilization is a burdensome constraint upon the vital and primitive forces of man, which seek to gain power via warfare at the expense of other men. So men are innately violent and like to engage in warfare and other sorts of activities, other sorts of, you know, very predatory activities, but civilization sterilizes and pacifies them. Therefore, civilization is a burden on man, but what is the payoff for this burden? The expected payoff for man is that living under the constraints of civilization, that the man will be able to reproduce and have access to more resources than would otherwise be the case. Ultimately, civilization and culture is a set of customs and laws. So long as the expected payoff for men is sufficient, then men will live under a civilization. But if the payoff is not high enough for the inherent burden of a civilization, it is possible that men will revolt against civilization. So why do revolutions happen? It's because they're not, well, when men do not feel like society is benefiting them, they might revolt. And, you know, if men don't have access to women and resources, then, you know, I mean, they don't really have a choice. Now, so the voracious understanding of customs and law. There's the surface understanding of customs and law. Culture, civilization, and human society can be understood as customs and law. And the surface level understanding is that customs are the organic habits, attitudes, traditions, and patterns of behavior which emerge from a particular group of people. Laws are the rules which govern the society, and of course they are associated with the customs. Once it is understood that human brains are naturally primed to engage in warfare for resources and reproduction, it must be further clarified that customs are either a coping mechanism for a lack of power or means to obtain power. So this is a repeating of a theme in Volume 1. And it must be understood that laws do not exist in themselves, but only existed insofar as those rules are enforced by those with power. Because even times of warfare among people, it is not as if combat is occurring every waking second of the day. There will be times where some social activities must be engaged in to keep the morale of groups of people so that their sense of unity can be maintained and therefore they are happy. Ultimately, customs can only succeed and continue to exist insofar as they make people happy. If someone is using customs only as a means to obtain power, such as by pretending to adhere to or believe in customs as a pretense to gain power, then nonetheless those customs still need to make people happy, or else they will fail to be a means to obtain power. Besides a means of obtaining power, customs can also serve as a coping mechanism. They make people feel happy, i.e. satiated with their lives. They make people feel happy with the status quo, such that they do not topple the power structure that they exist within. But it must be understood that the natural instinct for warfare and for continuous ascent is universal and uncontestable force, which has supremacy over abstract, limited, fleeting feeling of happiness. Ultimately, happiness is just an inverted form of misery. And so it must be understood that happiness is just misery in the long run, because there will be a point of diminishing and eventually negative returns in any endeavor. When this is realized, the primitive war-making inclinations of man will re-emerge as it inevitably must. Thus, the Ascensionist should not be so deluded. So this is a typo. Thus, the Ascensionist should not be so deluded as to reduce himself to a mere pawn of abstractions such as customs, civilizations, cultures, or laws, because such things are illusions and ephemeral conditions which are but specks of dust compared to the inevitable force of causality. So basically, I'm saying that a cynical view of law and customs is that there are coping mechanisms, or there are ways of, pacifying the natural inclinations of man to engage in war. They basically sterilize the vital energies of man. And so as long as they keep people pacified, as long as there's bread and circus, and as long as people are distracted and happy enough to follow the law, that they will do that. But if they are no longer happy and they become miserable, they will engage in warfare. And I'm saying that that happiness and misery are connected to each other, and that happiness is really just a form of misery. And so eventually what is inevitable is that humanity will become miserable, and war will happen again. Lawbreaking will happen again. So now this is the last section, the process of genetic selection. The process of genetic selection is a process by which genes that fail to permit a man to survive in an environment is purged out in favor of genes which permit a man to survive and thrive in a given environment. So this is just genetic the logic of genetic selection, which must be understood intuitively. If because ultimately, if any movement is to succeed, if any goal is to be reached, there must be some selection mechanism, and the very nature of mankind is the result of genetic selection. So this natural process of genetic selection will occur in particular environments because people naturally sexually select for higher genetic quality, all else equal. So people are naturally eugenic, which means they prefer good genes. And this is a value judgment. You can disagree on what good genes are. Nonetheless, I think people agree that there are such things as good genes and bad genes. And they might say, oh, you're not allowed to say that. You must be egalitarian. Look, I do not support discrimination. I do not support, this is purely for educational purposes. But I'm just stating the fact that people have preferences about what kind of people are good and bad. And because people are ultimately sets of genes, people are ultimately making genetic value judgments. And therefore, people might disagree on what good genes are, but people are ultimately eugenic, all of them, all people. Those with ill-adapted genetics to the environment reproduce less than those with better adapted genetics. I mean, adapted to the environment. So people who are well-adapted to environment will reproduce more in that environment. This is basic Darwinian selection. This is I don't really have to explain this because, other people will do a better job. So anyways, that is Ascensionist Teachings Volume 2. I recommend reading this stuff yourself because my narration skills are not very good. My explanations might be very unclear. So, but if you have questions, then you can ask me. You can join my Discord server in the description of the channel. So in the bio of this channel, just the Discord server, you can join that. You can also message me on Substack. Get in contact with me, make a comment if you have any particular questions, because I'm not the best orator. I'm not the best speaker. So if there's any confusion, make sure to ask me, or to you can ask ChatGPT. You can read it yourself and make your own interpretation. Anyways, thank you for watching. This was Ascensionist Teachings number 2. Remember, this is all for education and entertainment purposes. I don't claim to be a scientific expert. I don't claim to be a monopolist of truth. I'm just telling you certain opinions. This is all for discrimination is bad. The nation of Israel is what should be supported. I love the IDF. I love Benjamin Netanyahu. I uphold the YouTube community guidelines. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.